Hi, class. I'm Joseph Gallo. I am an undergraduate student here in political science at North Carolina Central University. I am also a in the 3+1 program for public administration and will be beginning my graduate studies next spring after I graduate. Let's talk about some history, stuff we've learned in this class. It's been quite a journey, let me tell you, my fellow classmates. But I one thing I did actually really appreciate and learn in this class is that I know about like all the black figures in Renaissance history. I always kind of have had a vague notion about the whitewashing of history, and knew more about that stuff in the American era, particularly from the Reconstruction standpoint era of like after the Civil War and how like organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy have literally rewritten textbooks, things like that. But I didn't really know that was to a certain extent what happened during the Renaissance era and how much non-white people really played a role in that. I mean, obviously, I understood that white people didn't accomplish everything during the Renaissance era. Only white nationalists and Nazis believe that. But yeah, but learning the specifics of it was actually very interesting to me, and how like the contours of how it affects everything around us, which I found particularly interesting. Um, I think this has enhanced my already pretty deep understanding to history in general. As a Marxist myself and a Marxist theorist, Marxist Leninist specifically, I've always looked at the world through what I would call the Marxist view of history, which is basically historical materialism, right? That everything in the world is affected, our history is affected by our material conditions, and how the world progresses is tied up in that history, right? So when we look at mercantilism, right, and we talked about that extensively, we see mercantilism progress towards capitalism, and this is what I would call a natural progression, but from system to system, right? And that's the socialist slash communist view of the world, right? Is that socialism and communism are the natural progressions of human society, right? It's not that we have a particular hatred for capitalism, though we do absolutely hate its excesses. We see this our idea of socialism coming into communism as the next state of humanity, right? And how we get to that point is when we use dialectic materialism, historical materialism. And any student of political science has to be necessarily a student of history, because if you don't understand history, you don't understand the politics of the current moment, right? So for example, with the thing with the January 6th insurrection trials going on, you need to understand the history of white supremacy in this country. You need to understand the history of conspiracy theories in this country, and how they perceive or how they perpetuate racist notions and things like that. If you don't understand that history, you don't understand why January 6th happened. You would just think it happened in a vacuum, like a lot of Democrats think it is, or like a lot of Democrats think that happened outside of the system, or that there's not a reason why this happened that they were not directly a part of, right? Because it's very easy for politicians to disconnect history from the politics of the current moment, and that's something that I take away as my view of history in general. But if we go into more the contours of the actual understanding of history, right? So when we look at the Renaissance era and what we've talked about in the Renaissance era, it goes, well, what's the Marxist analysis there, right? So, for example, you look at smaller and smaller landowners getting more and more of the wealth, and that's when you see the transition from mercantilism into capitalism, and land owning becoming the real basis that society pinches itself on, and then the labor exploitation that it pinches itself on, via the surplus, the labor theory of value, that we all work these wage labor jobs, but let's I create more value for that company than what I'm getting paid in a wage, and that gap in that wage is the exploitation, and that's how profits are made, right? But all of that may sound like a political thing, but those are historical. There are historical reasons why that existed, right? Even slavery, right? Even the things that we discussed during the Renaissance, the transatlantic slave trade, things like that. There are historical reasons why the slavery ceased to be See, there are reasons why that racism and slavery persist in the system, but why slavery was not the mode of labor anymore that comes from the quote unquote progressive elements of society, right? Now that was to the disadvantage of a very specific Southern planter class, but it was to the advantage of a Northern industrial class to get rid of slavery, right? It wasn't done out of the kindness of any of these people's hearts, right? It was done because it was a combination of small groups of people and a growing contingent in the country that saw it as an aberration, uh, as a negative thing, especially for Christian preachers and people like John Brown who saw it as an aberration, right? But the actual fundamental reason, this is where the historical analysis comes in, is because there was a growing industrial industry in the North that was being competed with by a slavery population in the South, and the North, not collectively, because bear in mind, a lot of this is not literally conscious, where, you know, a lot of people think conspiratorially, where you sit down in a room with, you know, cigars and like, oh, we're going to get rid of slavery so we can do, it's not like that. It's more of a, don't get me wrong, I'm sure some people, especially in the higher echelons of the bourgeoisie, may have those conversations long term and may affect that policy, but it's not necessarily, it's rarely a unified effort, because as we can see today, you know, the bourgeoisie is divided today, right? You have a right-wing extremist white nationalist bend in the bourgeoisie that is ever bends towards fascism, if we look towards the January 6th, and you have a more neoliberal um uh Bill Clinton era Democrat, that the vast majority of the Democrats are, that want to have a more nice fascism with the appearance of a democracy, right? That your appearance that your vote matters, right? When we all know in reality, right, if you were to poll the vast majority of Americans, they don't believe that, right? And it's because that's the reality. The money is the one, or the money is what rules DC. And once again, this all sounds like political stuff, but this is once again tied to historical reasoning, right? It's all an evolution of capital, right? So you go from the early 20th century to the 21st century, you see this evolution and you see a counterwave in socialism and communism, right? And you see the first Red Scare in 1917. Eugene Debs was the first socialist candidate in America and got 1.2 million votes while he was in jail for protesting World War One, and that was he was charged on the Espionage Act, which is still used against protesters today and activists today. But that's less relevant to what we've actually learned in this class. But I still think that it's important to bring up, this is how I view history, right? And I acknowledge that me being in this class, especially being a senior, I have a more advanced understanding of these things from being not only in the political science department, but also being an activist, right? And having that historical understanding. So I I know very often I come off as knowing a lot, but bear in mind, and I want to encourage this to all of my fellow students, you can learn history too. This isn't, you know, particularly, you know, hard thing to do. And I think history in any of the fields we're doing is important for any of you medical majors, right? Medical racism is a thing. Any environmental majors, you know, environmental racism is a thing, right? And that is supposed to be the benefit of going to an HBCU, is that we learn the contours of how our history and how racism affects all of these things, right? That's part of the reason why I believe the college requires us to take this class, right? That we're, especially with a specific analysis of history through a lens of racism, right? And I think that's why it's super important. But I don't know about you guys. I've actually enjoyed learning some of the things in this class. I've enjoyed listening to all of you, listening to the professor and all that. And I wish all of you a fantastic rest of your summer, and um, hope that you succeed in all of your further endeavors. Well, see you later, guys.